It started on a night that felt colder than usual, even though the thermostat was set the same as always. Peter woke up around 2:37 a.m. because he heard Brian pacing in the hallway, slow, uneven footsteps, like he was dragging one paw behind him. Peter got up, annoyed, ready to tell him to stop doing dog stuff so loudly. But when he opened the bedroom door, he froze. Brian was standing halfway down the hallway, but not like Brian. His back was arched, his fur stood straight up along his neck in jagged spikes, and he was breathing in long, shuddering gasps, as if every inhale hurt. Brian, you okay, buddy?" Peter asked. Brian turned toward him, not just his head, his entire upper body twisted in a way no dog's body should. His eyes were wide, unfocused, shaking. Before Peter could react, Brian charged. The hall lights flickered violently as Brian sprinted toward him, claws scraping deep into the wooden floor. Peter screamed and ran back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him just as something huge crashed into it from the other side. The door bent inward. Brian's growl, deeper, layered, wrong, vibrated through the walls. Then, suddenly, silence. Peter waited for minutes, maybe hours, too scared to move. When morning came, Brian was gone. For the next couple of days, the house felt wrong. Shadows moved a little too slowly. The nights lasted a few minutes longer than they should have. Lois asked where Brian was, but Peter couldn't explain without sounding insane. Chris swore he saw something big behind the garbage cans at 4 a.m. Meg said she heard heavy breathing outside her window. No one slept. 2 days later, they finally found him. Or what used to be him. A neighbor reported strange noises coming from the woods behind the Griffin house. Not screams, not growls, something between them. Peter, Lois, and Brian's old caller headed into the forest together, though none of them were sure why. The deeper they went, the more wrong the trees seemed. Bark peeled off in long strips. The branches were bent downward as if something huge had brushed through them. The air felt heavy, thick, pressing into their lungs. And then they saw it. A clearing. Dead quiet. No wind. No birds. In the center stood a creature, massive, hunched, covered in rough, spiked fur. Its neck bristled upward like a crown of knives. Its body was bigger than a bear, but its outline shifted and glitched, as if it wasn't fully connected to the world. Peter whispered, "Brian." The creature turned. For one split second, they saw Brian's face, stretched, trembling, begging, buried inside the monstrous shape. Then the face twisted into something else, something that wasn't Brian, something that had learned to wear his shape. The creature let out a long, hollow exhale that made the trees shake. Then it moved. Peter and Lois ran, but the forest twisted, paths curling into each other. Every direction looked the same. The creature followed without rushing. It didn't need to. It knew the woods better than they did. It knew how to wait. The final shot of the episode showed the Griffin living room, empty and quiet. Brian's food bowl sat by the wall. His collar was gone. The forest outside the window swayed unnaturally, like something large was moving between the trees. A pair of glowing eyes appeared for just one frame, too fast to register unless you paused. Then the screen cut to black. It all started when Peter noticed something small, almost too small to care about. But it stuck with him. Brian yawned after lunch, and for a brief second Peter saw two long, sharp fangs in his mouth. Not like a dog's, too smooth, too perfect, too deliberate. Peter asked if he was okay, but Brian immediately shut his mouth and said, "You're imagining things." His tone was calm. Too calm. That night, Peter heard Brian's claws scraping across the floor, much louder than usual, like the claws had somehow grown. The next day, something was off in the house. Brian spoke less, stayed in darker corners, and watched the family with a strange stillness. When Lois asked if he was sick, he simply said, I'm adjusting. Adjusting to what? He didn't explain. That same evening, Meg disappeared. Her room was untouched, her phone charging, her lights on. But she was gone without a trace. Peter panicked, but Brian said quietly, "She left. It's fine." His voice was deeper, layered, as if more than one voice was speaking through him. Peter felt fear rise in his chest, but no one else in the family reacted at all. By the third day, Brian's movements had changed. He didn't just walk, he glided, moving too smoothly for a living creature. His shadow on the wall stretched wider and taller than he was, and at night, Peter heard his breathing from multiple corners of the room at once, as though Brian existed in more than one place. Then Chris disappeared, then Lois. Their chairs were neatly pushed in, their beds made, nothing disturbed. Yet the house felt heavier, like the air had thickened. Their voices had filled the home just hours earlier, and now there was only empty silence. Peter ran from room to room, shouting their names, but the house swallowed the sound, muffling his calls. Brian barely spoke anymore. He only watched Peter. From doorways, from the top of the stairs, sometimes from right behind him without making a sound. And each time Peter saw him, he looked larger, broader, taller, as if he was outgrowing the shape of a dog. One morning, Peter woke up and realized there was no one left but them. Everyone had vanished quietly, like a TV muting itself mid-scene. He found Brian in the living room, or rather, the thing that had once been Brian. An enormous creature stood there on 4 massive limbs. Its fur bristled upward like jagged spikes. Its jaw was elongated and too wide, filled with exposed fangs that didn't fit in its mouth. Its eyes weren't eyes anymore, just deep cavities of shifting shadow. But it still spoke in Brian's voice, softly, calmly, almost kindly. "Peter, now it's just us, the way it's supposed to be." Peter backed away slowly, but the creature moved faster, sliding across the floor without footsteps, its shadow stretching across the entire room like spilled ink. It leaned down over him, and the walls trembled with each breath it took. "Don't be scared," it said. "I finally became what I was meant to be." Peter tried to scream, but no sound came out. The lights flickered once, twice, a third time, and in the final moment, all we see is a massive, shifting shadow engulfing Peter completely. The screen cuts to black. This episode didn't start the way Family Guy episodes normally do. There was no intro, no theme music, just a static shot of the Griffin house from what looked like a security camera. Peter was sitting on the couch, staring at a turned-off TV, too still, too straight. The rest of the family stood behind him in a half-circle, not moving, not speaking. The first sound in the episode wasn't their voices. It was a warped, reversed audio clip, so quiet it sounded like it came from another tape entirely. After it played, Peter slowly turned to the front door and said, "Lois, we should go outside now." Lois walked to the door, touched the handle and froze. The door didn't budge. She pulled harder. Nothing. Chris tried slamming into it with his shoulder, but instead of a wooden thud, the sound was hollow, metallic, like he was hitting a steel wall. Peter went to the window, but there was no street outside, no houses, just a blank white fog, perfectly still, like someone forgot to finish drawing the background. "This must be an editing error," Peter muttered, but the tone of his voice was wrong. Empty, like he was reading a line he didn't understand. Stewie noticed another detail. Every clock in the house had stopped at the exact same time. 3:17. Not moving. On the stove, on the microwave, on the phones. Even his own digital watch read 3:17. Meg tried to say something, but no sound came out. Her mouth moved, but the world had no audio for her. Brian barked her name, but suddenly the volume of everything in the house dropped, as if someone was turning down the sliders of reality. The camera shook slightly, like whoever was holding it breathed too hard. Peter returned to the door and said, "It should open. It always opened." He repeated it again and again. Same intonation, same pauses, like an audio clip looping. The house started changing. The kitchen lights flickered off, and when they flicked back on, the chairs were in different positions. Every family photo on the wall had been replaced with identical pictures of an empty room. 3:17 still glowed on every clock. Lois walked into the hallway and came back out of the same doorway she had just entered, even though that wasn't possible. She tried again. Same result. The house had folded in on itself. Brian suddenly noticed movement on the TV. It had turned on by itself. On the screen was a live feed of the Griffin living room, their living room. But the angle was wrong, like it came from somewhere impossibly high. "Peter, look at this," Brian said, but Peter was facing the wall, whispering, "It should open, it should open," in a perfectly looped rhythm. The image on the TV zoomed in. There they were, Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, Brian, standing exactly where they were standing now. Except their versions on the screen didn't have faces, just smooth surfaces where faces should be. Lois stepped closer to the TV. On the screen, the faceless Lois stepped closer too, but closer than she should have been. A full step closer. The broadcast glitched, zoomed in again. Now the faceless Lois was pressed right up against the imaginary lens. Lois staggered back in fear. The room lights flickered. When they returned, Meg was gone. Nobody reacted to her disappearance, as if she had never been there. Brian rushed to the door and pulled, but the wooden texture of the door felt wrong. Too smooth, too cold. It wasn't wood anymore. It was metal. Lois screamed Stewie's name as he ran into the kitchen and vanished mid-step. The doorway he passed through was now a solid wall. The windows sank into the paint and disappeared. The hallway shortened. Peter stood in the middle of the living room, motionless, repeating 3:17 over and over as his voice degraded into tape hiss. Brian was alone with him. Then the TV turned on again. The same living room. Only one figure now stood inside it. A tall silhouette with no face, no features, just staring. The camera zoomed in slowly, painfully slowly, as if dragged forward frame by frame. Brian looked around. Everyone else was gone. The house had become a perfect square, featureless, exitless. And in the corner of the room stood a tall shadow that hadn't been there before, facing Brian, closer than it should have been. The camera zoomed into its blank face. The screen cut to black. It started quietly. Joe Swanson stopped showing up at the Drunken Clam. He didn't answer calls. Even Quagmire said he hadn't seen him in days. Peter joked that Joe probably got stuck to his chair again. But deep down, he felt a strange, heavy unease. On the third day of Joe's disappearance, someone knocked on the Griffin door. Peter opened it and froze. Joe was standing there. Standing, on his legs, upright, balanced, as if he had always been able to walk. "Hey, Peter," Joe said softly, almost emotionlessly. Peter stepped back. "Joe, how are you? How are you standing?" Joe tilted his head slightly, like the question confused him. "I've always walked, Peter." His smile was tight, unnatural, stretched just a little too far. Peter told him to leave, but Joe calmly stepped inside the house, walking as smoothly as if gravity didn't affect him the same way it affected everyone else. He talked normally, but every line sounded rehearsed, like someone else was feeding him sentences. By nightfall, Peter was gone. The house was unnervingly silent, and in Peter's favorite armchair sat Joe, holding the TV remote as if he had been doing it for years. Lois acted like nothing was wrong. The kids didn't question it. When they said, "Dad," they were looking at Joe. Only Brian reacted, the only one who remembered Peter existed. The next day, Brian confronted him. "Where's Peter?" he demanded. Joe stared at him for an uncomfortably long time without blinking. "Peter's here," he finally said. "I'm Peter." His tone was so calm, so confident, it made Brian's stomach twist. That night, Brian heard footsteps. Not Peter's, not Joe's. Something heavier, slower, echoing in multiple parts of the house at once. He rushed to the living room. Joe was still there, sitting upright, watching the static-filled TV. But his shadow on the wall was wrong. Too tall, too stretched, too alive. On the fourth day, Brian went to the basement. He followed faint drag marks carved into the wooden floor. The air down there felt colder than it should, thick like fog you couldn't see but could feel in your lungs. In the far corner, Brian found a torn piece of a green shirt, Peter's shirt. And then he heard a weak groan, unmistakably Peter's. Brian stepped forward, but before he could follow the sound, the basement door slammed upstairs. "Peter!" he called, but the voice that answered was not Peter's. Joe was standing in the doorway, still, too still, taller than before. Or maybe the ceiling had somehow lowered. His face didn't move, but he was smiling. "You've learned too much, Brian," he said, voice almost echoing. Brian tried to run, but Joe's steps were unnaturally steady, too smooth for a man who used to rely on a wheelchair his entire life. When Joe grabbed him, Brian felt an icy, metallic grip, like the hands weren't made of flesh anymore. "I'm Peter," Joe whispered, "and I'm staying." The final shot of the episode was the Griffin living room. Lois cooked dinner as if nothing had changed. Meg and Chris watched TV, and sitting in Peter's armchair was Joe, perfectly still, perfectly composed, wearing Peter's calm expression like a mask. No sign of Brian anywhere, just his collar lying in the shadow near the couch. The episode cut to black without sound. At first, everything in the Griffin house seemed completely normal. Brian was sitting in the kitchen with the family, lazily chewing on leftovers and cracking a few jokes like he always did. But later that evening, he found some old container in the trash, something Peter had tossed out days ago, and without thinking twice, Brian licked it clean. Nobody paid attention to it at the time, but that's when the strange things started happening. The next day, Brian became unusually quiet. He barely spoke, didn't bark, didn't complain, and spent most of the day lying under the table, almost as if he was avoiding the light. Lois thought he just ate something bad and gave him some medicine, but it didn't help. That night, Brian kept waking up and pacing around the house in circles, making a low, restless growl that didn't sound like him at all. On the third day, the family noticed something odd about Brian's expression. His eyes had a heavier, focused look, like he was constantly thinking about something they couldn't understand. When Peter tried to scratch behind his ear, Brian jerked back sharply, staring at the wall behind Peter, as if he heard something no one else could. And then the physical changes started. Very subtle at first. Brian seemed just a tiny bit bigger in the morning, then a little bigger that evening. And by the end of the day, he looked noticeably larger than before. Even his teeth began to change. His once normal dog teeth were growing into long, sharp fangs, though Brian acted like he didn't even notice. On the fourth night, Brian began leaving the house. Each morning, the front door would be slightly open, and Brian would come back covered in dirt and carrying the smell of cold forest air, even though the nearest forest was nowhere near their neighborhood. The family grew worried, but nobody knew what to do. Peter tried putting him on a leash, but Brian just stared at it so long and so intensely that Peter felt uncomfortable and ended up taking it off himself. On the fifth day, Brian stopped responding to his name entirely. He just sat by the window, staring into the darkness as if someone out there was calling him. Stewie tried talking to him, but Brian replied with a deep, steady growl that didn't sound like him at all. It sounded like it belonged to a much bigger dog. That night, the house filled with heavy footsteps, even though nobody was walking. Lois woke up first and heard something slowly coming down the stairs. When she peeked into the hallway, she saw only a large dog-like shadow moving across the wall. She told herself it was just her imagination and went back to bed. By morning, Peter and Lois were gone. Their phones were left on the living room table. Their bedroom door was open, but they were nowhere in the house. Chris and Meg were missing too. No signs of a struggle, no sounds, nothing. The whole place felt unnaturally silent, like every living thing had simply disappeared. The only thing left was Brian's collar, lying in the middle of the living room floor. That evening, the TV turned on by itself. The screen showed the sidewalk outside their house. The camera shook a little, but for a moment you could clearly see a giant dog-shaped figure standing in the distance. It looked like Brian, or like something that used to be Brian, only much larger. It paused as if realizing it was being watched, and slowly turned its head toward the house. The screen cut to black. Since then, the Griffin house has stayed empty. But neighbors say that sometimes, late at night, they hear heavy footsteps outside and a low, familiar growl echoing down the street. And nobody is brave enough to look out the window.